Welcome back to another episode of the J-Area Podcast. My name is Jose Ramos Jr., and as a lifelong fan of movies, this is my opportunity to share some of my personal favorites, as well as my own thoughts on each film. Now, for those of you who are returning from last week's episode, you would know that I covered Wes Craven's original Scream film, one of my favorite films of all time, certainly my favorite slasher of all time. And one of the most notable characteristics of that film was its opener, and how it was able to introduce a character like Casey Becker, who many people thought was going to be the main protagonist of the film, and essentially kill her off in a surprising and shocking fashion. And with a movie like Scream, there's going to be tons of references and tributes to horror movies of the past, and just demonstrating how it has evolved over time. And there was no better example of that opener, with Drew Barrymore playing Casey Becker, because in that opener, it's basically paying tribute to this week's episode, that is Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. It is one of the more influential films of all time, regardless of its genre, as it is able to pave the way for what slashers have become throughout the 80s, the 90s, and certainly to today. Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho was released on September 8th, 1960, described as an American horror film based on the 1959 novel of the same name by Robert Bloch. The film Psycho centers around a Phoenix secretary embezzling $40,000 from her employer's client, goes on the run, and checks into a remote hotel run by a young man under the domination of his mother. What makes the movie Psycho so interesting, in my opinion, is there's so many layers to its story, to its development, and to the long-lasting legacy that it leaves behind. For those who know the behind-the-scenes production and development of the film, we'll dive into that in a moment, but even through that, through the filming process and the simplicity and the innovation that Alfred Hitchcock is able to provide in this film, it's no wonder why it has become so influential and so successful so many years later. I know growing up at a young age, I always had the fascination when it came to horror films, whether it was supernatural, whether it was the slasher genre, or anything of that nature. And Psycho was certainly one of those movies that was always on my radar because it was one of the older films. It was in black and white, and it just maintained that presence. It had iconic moments that have lived in different genres and different movies, whether it's the iconic shower scene, whether it's the twist ending at the end, which we'll get to, or simply the idea of an unnamed or mysterious figure going off and slaying other people. I would go through many years as an adolescent knowing of the movie, knowing bits and pieces of the plot, but it wasn't until more recently, I believe it was like in 2018, when I finally had taken the time to watch the movie. And I was pleasantly surprised to see the quality, not only in the filmmaking, but just the storytelling in itself. It's a tale that really transcends its time, especially given the controversial nature of the film as well as the topic of discussion that it centers around. Alfred Hitchcock is able to provide a film not only for a generation, but just for filmmaking in general. This is a film that can be used as a blueprint for many cases in terms of horror, in terms of mental health, and certainly in terms of the relationship that one has with its family members or any other people that they encounter. Initially, this film was divided by critics due to its controversial nature of the film, but due to audience interest and the box office performance, it was critically acclaimed and even earned 4 Oscar nominations that included Best Director and Supporting Actress. It also set a new level for acceptability in terms of violence, deviant behavior, and sexuality within American film. It's also, as I mentioned, the earliest example of what a slasher film could become. The film Psycho was actually based on a book entitled Psycho as well, and it was loosely based on the Wisconsin murderer Ed Gein. That name, may sound familiar because it also inspired that of the Halloween and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Ed Gein was known to be a grave robber, and interesting enough, he had lived 40 miles away from the author of that book. Ed Gein and Norman Bates maintain some level of similarities as, quote, each had deceased domineering mothers that they had sealed off in a room in their home and actually had a shrine to them. It was also noted that they would be dressed in women's clothing. Ed Gein was apprehended after only 2 murders. Peggy Robertson, who was an assistant to Hitchcock, had read a review for the book and showed it to him. At that time, Paramount Pictures had already rejected the premise for a film, and Hitchcock was able to attain the rights of the book at $9,500, and had Robertson actually order all copies of the book in order to help preserve the novel's surprises. See, Alfred Hitchcock was very much into telling a story and being able to save the ending and saving surprising and shock twists so that it only enhances the audience's viewing pleasure. If you're going to have a famous book or a famous story being told, you want to be able to limit its knowledge and its information to the public. That way, when they consume that film, they can also remember and feel that sense of excitement and horror when they find out whether there's a twist or not. So I respect and I commend Alfred Hitchcock of going the extra mile, because that's that kind of dedication where you don't really see as much. Everyone knows that in certainly today's Hollywood, films being made, franchises being created, they all have an intellectual property that is being established, whether it's from Marvel Comics, DC Comics, 80s stuff like, G.I. Joe and Transformers. Everything has been already created, and so they're just building upon these intellectual properties. That's why so many films are either being remade, rebooted, or getting sequels. So at this time, I certainly respect the efforts that Alfred Hitchcock goes to trying to maintain its originality and surprise the audience with the content of the plot itself. It was also at this point that Alfred Hitchcock was experimenting and looking for new material for films, since his last couple films that had came out weren't as successful. Paramount executives had refused his proposal, as well as providing his usual budget. They didn't think it was necessary to make this film, obviously for its violent nature, but also based off of the films that he had previously made. They weren't really box office successes, so they didn't see the point of budgeting and supporting it financially, as it would only cost them more money. But Alfred Hitchcock would counter this with producing in black and white to cut costs, and would even utilize his own crew from his show, Alfred Hitchcock Presents. The Paramount executives would reject this again, as their sound stages that were already being in use had been fully booked. So not only could he provide his own crew and cut costs doing black and white, they would tell him that, hey, we don't even have a location, we don't have a soundstage for you to use. It's already booked. Hitchcock, who was very adamant and very determined to have this film being made because he was very passionate about the story, he was very passionate about making this film, and wanted to do one for himself. Not that the studio had asked him to make the film, but he wanted to make this film for himself. So he then counters that offer and tells them that he will personally finance the movie and film it at Universal's lot if Paramount would distribute the film. All this information and all this story and background is also covered in the Anthony Hopkins film Hitchcock, which I highly recommend. It has Alfred Hitchcock and Scarlett Johansson in that film. It details how he was at that moment in his career and how he's beginning to fall off and wanting to use some experimentation and introduce a little bit of a thriller and horror into his work. When promoting this film, Alfred Hitchcock did a lot of the promotion himself. He wanted to do it instead of the actors because he feared that, in the process, they might spoil the ending of the film. And that was very much a key point that Alfred wanted to make when making this movie. He did not want it to spoil. He did not want it to ruin the ending. So he only trusted the one person he could, and that was himself, to promote it. In fact, he would even beg audience members who had seen the movie to not spoil it, to preserve that ending so that other people can enjoy it. And he would urge theaters and their employees to not allow any individual who was late to get into the movie. He wanted people to have a full experience with this film. He wanted them to come in, buy their concessions, get the tickets, get in line, get in the theater, and watch the film in its entirety, rather than having them come in and miss the first 5 minutes. Because I don't know about you, but I've been in times where I would be watching a movie and I have my popcorn, I have my soda, and I'm getting ready, and we're already like 15 minutes into the movie. And you have individuals just barely filing in and finding their seats. They don't even know that in those first 15 minutes, you're missing a lot of exposition. You could be missing out a lot of information about who the characters are, what's the conflict that they're dealing with, or what's even the setting that they're being involved with. And I certainly don't know. And then it's like, I don't know their situation. Maybe they're running late. Maybe something happened. But that's always just an interesting point for me, is like, if I'm going to watch a movie, I'm going to get there early so I can even catch the previews, to catch the trailers. Because it's just going to ruin the experience of watching a movie by missing out the first 15 minutes. So he was very adamant on urging theaters that they should not allow late individuals into the theater, and therefore spoiling the experience for themselves, as well as other people who are already enthralled and invested in the story that's being told. Because I don't know about you, but if I'm in a dark room watching a movie and I see the door open and the light just shines in, again, it kind of takes away from the experience. So the film stars Janet Leigh as Marion Crane, Anthony Perkins as Norman Bates, Vera Miles as Lila Crane, and John Gavin as Sam Loomis. And what I love about this movie as well is, again, just the simplicity of the plot. We open the film following Sam Loomis and Marion Crane, two individuals who are clearly enamored with one another, is now seeing Marion Crane. She's heading off to her job, and there's a new client for her boss who's basically flaunting all this money that he has. It's $40,000, which is a lot of money in 1960. And he's very extravagant, very flamboyant with his money, and he presents this kind of cockiness and arrogance because of how much he has. He urges Marion Crane's boss, like, here's the $40,000. Marion's boss then tells him to take it to the bank. Obviously, they don't want that in the building overnight, because if anything happens to the money, it could be this whole ordeal. She ends up going up to her boss and saying, hey, can I go home for the day? I'm not really feeling that well. She promises to take the money to the bank, go home, rest up. That's not what ends up happening, because she takes the $40,000 and plans to run away with it to go find Sam Loomis so they can begin their lives. Now, for some, especially for myself, who is a big fan of the slasher genre, and having seen movies like Friday the 13th and Halloween and etc., it's a little bit of a slow build. But I think that's very necessary for this kind of film, and also keeping in mind the setting and the year that it was released. In these early moments when we're with Marion Crane and we're at her job and we're meeting everybody, we're meeting Sam Loomis, this is an opportunity to develop that relationship with Marion and follow her throughout the beginning of the film. I also really enjoy how in the moments when she's in the car alone and we hear the audio of her coworker and her boss, as well as the new client, talking to each other about where's the money, where's Marion. And I feel like that conversation that's carried off, audio-wise, is left up to interpretation, because it could be looked up as two different ways. Is that the literal conversation that they're having amongst one another, or is it Marion subconsciously in her mind imagining that this is what they're talking about while I'm gone? And it only builds on the sense of paranoia and worry that she has as she's fleeing away with these $40,000. She goes as far as to go to a small, dealership to trade in her car and get a new car in order to match the license plate of California, where she's trying to go meet Sam Loomis. By the way, which I had not mentioned, Sam Loomis, which is also, again, for Halloween fans, is a clear reference to Samuel Loomis, who, same name. Of course, keeping in mind that Halloween came in after Psycho, but I just like seeing that these films have like a direct lineage to one another and just paying tribute to each other. Essentially, she goes and she gets the new car, and even doing so, she has a police officer trailing her and following her for any suspicious activity, because he had found her sleeping inside the car, pulled over to the side of the road. Again, it's just that sense of paranoia, as I mentioned, just continuing to build. It begins raining one night, and she has to pull over and stay at a motel. But it's not just any motel, it is the infamous Bates Motel, where we meet Mr. Norman Bates, who essentially, in the beginning, is very unassuming, and he seems like a very normal guy. He does have some subtle characteristics that might be a little bit alarming, namely his relationship with his mother and how she basically is very domineering and controlling over what he does or what he's able to say, and just how she speaks to Norman in a way you can definitely tell and infer what kind of relationship the two have with one another. Norman is very kind. He's very respectful, he's very courteous, and he treats Marion with very much respect. In fact, he's very helpful in helping her check into the motel. The one, off-putting thing about his interaction with her is placing her in room number 1, which is right next to the office. And his reasoning for it is because he wants to be helpful to her and make sure that if she needs anything, he's literally just one door away. But what he does once she's all situated inside her room, he peeps through the wall because there's like a little peephole. That's like the one biggest off-putting thing between that interaction. Also, he does state that one of his hobbies is taxidermy, which I don't know about you, but everyone has a hobby, but that is certainly one of the more interesting choices in hobbies. And there's a lot of visual representation of a bird throughout the office. The bird is very much present throughout this film of Psycho. I would also like to think that's somehow connected to Alfred Hitchcock's films, The Birds. Again, I certainly would like to think that that's something he had in mind when he was putting that into the movie Psycho. But still, being so early into the film, we're only meeting Norman Bates for a short while, and of course hearing how his mother is speaking to him, and he has this interaction with Marion where they share, well, essentially he says they're going to share a meal during the rainfall, that way she's not alone. But just the conversation that they have with one another about his relationship with his mother and how he says she isn't really fit anymore, and it's alluded to the fact that she's now up there in age and she might not be mentally as fit as she once was. Marion makes a suggestion of, what if you were to put her in some place? And this quickly aggravates Norman, and he says, what do you mean put her in some place? You would assume that people just put people in places like that, and that you're not helping them, you're just leaving them essentially and giving up on them. And Norman is he feels very much disrespected in this way. He doesn't want to put her away. It's not that she's crazy. He tries to defend her and defend the way that she berates him, and he supports this by saying that she's a little mad sometimes. He says, in fact, we all can go a little mad sometimes. And it's those line deliveries by Anthony Perkins that I really find him to be endearing. It's a way where he's able to level with us. Although we might not know his situation in life, he very much so is just an average guy. And that's one thing I always find interesting about movies, is that in certain places, in certain examples, we as an audience member are just dropped into their lives. We don't know the encounters that Norman Bates has had weeks, months, years before this event. We don't know what kind of relationship he has with his mother, or with women, for that matter. Because at this point, him talking to Marion, you can sense that there's a little bit of interest on Norman's part. And of course, how can you blame him? Norman Bates is here on a remote location, a motel that is basically on a lonely street. He says that they had moved the highway a couple streets over, so they're not getting as much business. So he's not seeing as many people. So when an attractive young woman like Marion Crane stops by Bates Motel, you can't blame him for, gaining a little bit of interest in that sense. After they're done eating and they have their, conversation inside the office, they decide they're going to call it a night. And Marion Crane is going to go take a shower. She's going to go get some rest and then move forward with what's next. She's already contemplating about going back home, back to her job, and returning the money and just, owning up to it and moving on with her life. Is she going to get in trouble? Maybe, but at least she'll know in her conscience that, like, hey, I did the right thing. You can sense that she now feels guilty. She feels that sense of guilt that I know what I'm doing is wrong. Why am I doing it? And after having this conversation with Norman, she now realizes that, well, here's my opportunity to right these wrongs. So the next time we see Marion, she's entering the shower. And it is the most iconic scene in the film. It's one of the more iconic scenes in film history. As she's taking a shower, we see a shadowy figure off in the distance. You essentially only see the silhouette of this mysterious figure. And as they peel back the shower curtain, they begin to violently stab Marion Crane, killing her in the process. With the musical score that they included in this film, it's up there with something like the Jaws theme, where it has been replicated and parodied in so many other films. The blood that is used in this scene is actually Hershey chocolate syrup, which they said shows up better in black and white and has a more realistic density than the stage blood that would be typically used. The knife sounds that are piercing through Marion are actually knives going through a large melon, which I always found interesting because I'll share a short personal story. But there was one trip that we had gone to when I was younger to Universal Studios, and they had like this interactive show where they would invite people up to a stage and basically help take part in like the production of a scene. What we would do is they chose random people out in the audience, and they would bring them on stage and interact with certain sound equipment. So, for example, they had played a scene from Seabiscuit, which starred Tobey Maguire, who was also referenced on the very first episode of this podcast. Be sure to check out the first episode, Spider-Man 2002. They showed a scene from there, and he's on the horse, and as he's racing down the track, it's all muted. But I was one of the kids chosen to participate in this little interactive event, and it was like a roll of carpet that you would find at like a department store, and after beating it like a drum, it records, and they basically copy and paste it to the Seabiscuit scene. And I've always found it very interesting how what cameras will pick up visually is one thing, but the audio noise is added separately in order to make sure that it's enhanced, that it's clear and concise, and really matches up with what the audience is supposed to interpret. So I've always found that aspect of filmmaking very interesting, and that's why when scenes like this occur, I like to look into how are they replicating that noise, because obviously they're not piercing her with a real knife. It's actually going into a melon. This scene is very symbolic as it represents, in my opinion, like a baptism. It's washing away her guilt. It's purging her of her sins and the crimes that she has committed. Although she never really gets to rectify her wrongs, in a sense, in the shower, in the scene that this mysterious figure kills Marion, it is purging her of those sins. In fact, she doesn't have to worry about them no longer. Now, for one point, because she's no longer living, but also because it's that opportunity to rid her evil from the world. The aftermath that follows this scene is very interesting as well, as it demonstrates Norman Bates coming through and finding out that Mother was the one that had killed Marion. He basically cleans up the bathroom and gets rid of the body and gets rid of the shower curtain, but it also gives audience members time to recover, because this was a very shocking scene, not only because it was so early into the movie that we're getting rid of a protagonist, a main protagonist, but it also gives them an opportunity to experience this uncomfortable nature of the cleanup. It's almost like we're not supposed to see this part, because certainly in film today, they just want you to see the main spectacle. They want you to see the main scene, but to see the aftermath and having this long drawn out scene where we're with Norman in the cleanup stages, it's like, wow, like what did I just watch? And keep in mind, for audience members back in 1960, this really pushed the envelope and moved the boundaries of what was acceptable in terms of violent scenes. So just putting myself in that situation, in that scenario, I can understand why this was very shocking, why it was very controversial for many film goers, for many moviegoers at that time. And when researching for this film, I also thought it was interesting that what brought Marion to the Bates Motel. It was the rainfall. She had to pull over because the rain was just too strong. She had to get some rest. The rainfall in itself foreshadows that shower scene. She enters the Bates Motel with rainfall, and she exits the Bates Motel, again, with the shower raining on her. Of course, after this, during the cleanup, Norman Bates unknowingly gets rid of the body, but also unknowingly gets rid of the money, the $40,000. He never knew anything about the money. So the money becomes inconsequential. It's no longer at play for anybody. It doesn't matter. It's not the focal point of this journey. It was just a means of getting her away from the job into the Bates Motel. So now that both are gone, we're now left as audience members as, well, where do we go now? Well, I'll tell you where we go. We go and we follow Lila. We follow Lila Crane, the sister of Marion, who now is searching for her sister. The boss and the coworker can't get in contact with her. The sister now can't get in contact with her. So she has to contact the next best thing, and that's Sam Loomis. So she goes over and looks for Sam Loomis and is trying to discover, where's my sister? Where is she in all of this? Because now we have a missing person. In fact, Lila hires a private investigator to help her find where her sister is at. So now we move from one protagonist in Marion, and we're now following Lila. That's very innovative for its time, and it's something that many filmmakers would try to replicate in future films. In the 63 years that this film has came out, many people, and of course Scream being one of them, as we just covered in last week's episode, they would try to replicate this. And although some would be successful, you always remember the first. And the way this is done is just fantastic. And it's after we lose Marion that the next most interesting character, in my opinion, and without a doubt the main character of the franchise for that matter, is Anthony Perkins as Norman Bates. Because now you recognize that he knows what happened to Marion. He knows that Mother is responsible. She is the culprit for this murder, and she is the one that we're after, essentially, as the main antagonist. Of course, we've reached the point in the film where I have to advise you that if you haven't seen this film, go out and do yourself a favor. Find it anywhere you can, whether it's on rental on Amazon Prime. If you can find it on Blu-ray, that's where I purchased my copy. On the Steelbook edition, I highly recommend you go out and you watch this movie. At least watch it once. It's one of those movies you have to at least say you've seen. Because now we're going to be going into spoiler alert details, and I'm going to be talking about the big twist ending. And for those that are still here and haven't heeded my warning, or maybe you've already seen the film and you want to drop by on this episode just to talk about Psycho, well, thank you for staying this long, because now obviously we know that Sam Loomis and Lila, they make their way to the Bates Motel trying to look for Marion, to no avail, right? Sam Loomis is trying to distract Norman Bates as they talk in the motel office. And this opens the opportunity for Lila to head over to the Bates house so she can go talk to Mother. She finds Mother in the basement, although it's not exactly how you would anticipate finding Mother. She finds Mother as a corpse. She's a full-on skeleton, and this frightens Lila, but not before Norman Bates busts through the door, completely dressed in a dress with a wig on, and just frantically screaming that I'm Norma Bates. Norma Bates being the name of his mother. Sam Loomis not too far behind and apprehends him and prevents Norman from attacking Lila, going for a 2-for-1 special on the Marion Lila Crane deal. And it's very just sudden. It's very, hit and miss. Like, you're caught off guard by what you're seeing, because now you recognize that Norma Bates, the mother, was never at play. She was always a corpse, and it was Norman who was committing these crimes, committing this murder, and it was all in his head. And it's that closing scene at the police department where we see I believe it was some kind of medical therapist or psychologist of some sort, who was speaking with Norman and trying to explain to the officers and the authorities that Mother was very much responsible for these murders, but not in the capacity that we're used to. You see, Norma had been killed many years before by Norman, and in essence, she lives within him. See, this might have been one of the early instances that a film had experimented with split personality, or what I believe to be dissociative identity disorder, which is something that we've seen in films like Split that starred James McAvoy. And it's very interesting to see the psychology and how they dive into the mental state of Norman Bates, because although Norman seemed to be an average, ordinary guy, not a care in the world, it was this alter ego, this alter personality within him that was Mother, that took control whenever he was in the presence of a woman, in the presence of another female, because it demonstrated the relationship he had with his real mother, and that she was very domineering, very controlling, and she didn't want Norman to be around other women. She wanted to be the only one for his eyes. And for those who are interested within that relationship between Norman and Norma, I highly recommend that you check out the Bates Motel series that stars Freddie Highmore. It was on A&E for a few years. Last time I checked, it was on Netflix. But that relationship and that story between the two is covered in 5 seasons, and I think it's the perfect precursor, the perfect predecessor and requisite to enjoy what this film is and what has become legacy-wise. But going back to this film in itself, it really does a great job of separating the two in order to make the audience believe that they are two different human beings. Whenever we hear Norman speak, we know it's Norman. We know it's Norman Bates. We know it's him. When it's Norma, we never really see her face. We never really see her body, with the exception of these silhouettes or him carrying her from a distance. They do a really good job of separating the two. What I also like is I keep going back to that Norman Bates, just he's portrayed as this normal average guy. But it also supports the notion that the world's biggest monsters are amongst the most average individuals. Again, I go to the examples of guys like Ted Bundy, who many individuals thought to be charming. They thought he was very charismatic. They thought they were someone that you can get along with just going to the department store, not knowing that he was capable of committing these devious crimes. And although this film really tackles that idea of, an average guy, it does assess the topic of mental health and mental disorders, such as the split personality or DID, as I mentioned before. But there's even that sense of homosexuality or drag, because Norman Bates does dress as a woman, and he does, feel himself and identify himself to be that of a woman when he's mother, in a sense. There is a comment towards the end of the film where one of the authority members claimed, they say, like, well, was he a transvestite? And the therapist or psychologist, the medical profession, he says, no, not at all. He is Norman Bates, but he's suffering from a split personality disorder. So he's very much who he is in that state. And I find that very interesting, going back to the 60s, because this is the 1960s, where times were very different. The social climate was very different in so many different demographics. So to see that Alfred Hitchcock was able to, again, produce this film with his own money, with his own vision, of course having the direction of the novel that was, developed before it, but to have that presence of mind to be able to develop something that can still be studied 63 years later, because it's still a topic of discussion demographically, of course. The film itself has aged so well, not only in that sense, but also in what it has done for filmmaking, because it was able to tackle controversial topics such as the ones that we have just mentioned. And I think it definitely earns merit, and it earns that opportunity to be studied by everybody, by whether it's medical professionals, whether it's authorities, whether it's filmmakers, or just film fans like myself. Because the censorship and the topics that were deemed to be taboo that are covered in this film, of course I mentioned the split personalities and etc., everything I've mentioned before that. But you look to even just the opening of the film itself, where it's an unmarried couple shown in the same bed in 1960, that was deemed too sexual at that time. Whereas nowadays, a PG-13 film, you could show a lot in a PG-13 film that was deemed way too risque for back in 1960. Just seeing Marion Crane in the beginning without a shirt, that's commonplace for film nowadays because it's just a shirt. It's not that big of a deal. But in 1960, when they were very conservative and very protective of what they were showing to mass audiences, that wouldn't have flown back then. In fact, to the point where this film, Psycho, was the very first film in the United States to have shown a toilet being flushed. That is crazy. That's amazing to think about nowadays in film. As something as simple as a toilet being flushed because it was deemed inappropriate, it was deemed too risque. And I can go on and on about how this film really opened the doors for filmmakers to be more creative and have more range with topics like horror, violence, and sexuality. But one thing that always sticks with me is how we're able to stay with a remote location like the Bates Motel and tell this well-crafted story, albeit it is short. It is something condensed. It's very small and small scale, but it's very rich in the way it's being told and the characters that are being shared and the motives and the backgrounds that each character has. And another thing that I'm a big fan of is the term that less is more. When we see the shower scene, we don't see anything, essentially. We don't see much of Marion Crane's body. We don't see much of the violence that is being inflicted upon her by Norman Bates, aka Norma, mother, because it's left up to the imagination. Very much so like with the shark from Jaws. You don't really see him as much. You don't really see much as Michael Myers. We don't see his face. It's left up to the imagination. Because when we're shown something and expected to have some kind of visceral reaction, whether it's shock or horror, it can't be matched with the imagination that we have, because what we imagine could be far more worse than what is actually being done. When you leave it up to the mental psyche, that is where the horror is at. That is where the true scares are developed. And not only that, but then you go back to the relationship between Norman and Norma and the preceding years when she was still alive, living with him. What kind of relationship did they have? Because it's insinuated that it was an abusive relationship, whether it was, verbal, emotional, or physical. You can only imagine what the two had endured with one another. And again, it's kind of expressed in the Bates Motel series. Again, I can't recommend that enough for psycho fans, for horror fans to check out. I definitely do recommend that. And as we close with this episode, it's a perfect segue for next week's episode, because if you thought this mother and son relationship was very interesting and enthralling, as much as I did in terms of the horror aspect, then I can't wait to share next week's episode. I won't flat out give you the name of the episode, but I'll give you that cliffhanger that it is involving another mother and son dynamic in horror. And that's all the biggest hint I can give you. And if you enjoyed this episode, if you enjoyed the movie Psycho, please remember to give this episode a like, subscribe, follow, give me any feedback. Let me know what kind of films you want me to follow or review. It's always really fun, and I look forward to going through with these movies with you guys. So, again, you know where to find me, JustJose_3 at TikTok, on YouTube, the J Area Podcast. You can find it on Spotify. Thank you guys so much, and I look forward to next week's episode. I'll see you guys then.